Hello, everyone. My name is Steph Scaglia, and I'm a third-year political science student currently at NYU DC, but from NYU Shanghai. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar, Salon series, Oscar Wilde's Italian Dream, with author Renato Miracco, made possible by NYU DC Dialogues, NYU Florence, and the NYU College of Arts and Sciences Remark Institute and Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. The discussion will delve further into Renato Miracco's most recent work, Oscar Wilde's Italian Dream, 1875 to 1900, and expert panelists for this webinar include Renato Miracco himself, author, art critic, and curator, Uli Bayer, professor of German and comparative literature, Stefano Evangelista, associate professor of English at Oxford University, and Lucy Ryle, professor from the Department of History and Civilization at the European University Institute. Moderating the conversation is Perry Klass and Larry Wolf, co-directors at NYU Florence. Please be sure to enter any questions you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which Perry and Larry will turn to towards the end of the webinar. Perry and Larry, thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Perry and I are really delighted to welcome you all virtually to NYU Florence, Villa La Pietra. Perry?
We're so happy to be able to do this. Thank you for joining us.
We're really excited to be partnering with Tom McIntyre at NYU Washington to host this event, also with the NYU Remark Institute in New York and the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. NYU Florence, Villa La Pietra, is created as a product of the Anglo-American encounter with Italy, that is to say, the encounter of the Acton Mitchell family with Italy in the early 20th century. And it's one of the reasons we're especially excited to have the chance to talk about this book. Renato Miracco has just published it. It's an amazing book. We're excited to be discussing it today with a panel of experts. Renato, as Stephanie said, is a very distinguished art critic and art curator. He's also has been the Italian cultural attaché in Washington, which is why this event is a joint Italian-Washington production within NYU. And Renato has therefore played the role of ambassador of Italian culture in the United States and has been honored for that role by the Italian Republic and by President Obama. So this book is the product of a long line of record of representing the relationship between the Anglo-American world and Italy. And the first thing that I want to do is turn the floor over to Renato to talk a little bit about how he came to write this book. Please, Renato, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody to be present and to be supporting me. Wow. After this introduction, what should I say? I should be silent because after Obama and President Mattarella, and I was just working with the Quirinale for more than 15 years. So it was really amazing for me. I would like just to underline, I'm not a literary scholar, I'm not an academic. My academic field is much more in art. I was teaching art in Salerno when I was really young. But in my life, I don't know how to change from to transfer. In my life, Oscar Wilde was really an important plays really an important role in my life. This is why I came up with this book. The first part of this book, only a few letters, I published in 1975 with Colonnese. I have to be grateful with Colonnese, with Gaetano and Maria Colonnese, who just trust me just to publish this one. It was the little book. I was with them. I published with them, but then along my long career, I wrote more than 82 catalogs. I was really lucky just to work with incredible museums all over the world, from Tetyakov Gallery in Moscow to Tate Modern to Metropolitan Museum, South America, Pinacoteca d'Estado, blah, blah, blah. The idea of Wilde was really present in my life. It seems strange, seems odd. I don't want to be much personal, but give me, I really would like just to give you just a little bit of a background. I was born in Naples from an Albanese father and Neapolitan mother. I was learning how to read when I was 4 years old. I will be brief, don't worry. And I was learning how to read with my grandma. And I was, okay, fairy tale, a lot of imaginary word. And then I passed from fairy tale, from Cinderella, I don't know, to Oscar Wilde tales, for children, you know what I mean? So it was really amazing for a 5-year-old boy to read Oscar Wilde when he was really, really young. And Oscar Wilde gave to me just the sense of try to be what you are without any box, without any constraint, without any be what you are. And the freedom that Oscar Wilde gave to me since I was a kid was really, really amazing. And in the meantime, the same freedom that Edmund White gave to me when I was much more older. It's not about sex. It's not about sexuality, gender. It's about freedom. So you can love what you want. You can love in the moment of your life. I was so lucky just to love a man, to love a woman. I got married, I have 3 beautiful kids. Then now I got married with a man recently. And Oscar Wilde was always in my, I don't want to say, I was praying for Oscar Wilde every single night for a long time, saying, give me the strength, please. And that's, it's really what now I would like just to share with you. This is the first time I was in Paris studying art in Paris. So I went to the Reserve. The Reserve is the most private library all over the world, and I found some letters from Oscar Wilde in the Reserve from Naples. So I love Oscar Wilde since I was a kid. I was born in Naples. I was born on 15th of October, and he was born on 16th October. So it was really, I don't know. That's was something really impressive to me. And I went there and I found some beautiful letters. I found some beautiful extract of Oscar Wilde, and I thought about publishing the book in Italian. It was really shocking in 1975 when I published the first book of Oscar Wilde. And then along this year, I did some other research, some other incredible, as you say, incredible interview about Oscar Wilde. And now I decided 4 years ago just to publish a new book. And it takes me 4 years just to come up with this book. And this book is just to give you just a sense, is divided into 3 parts. One part, it's the seduction of Italy at the beginning of the 19th century. Then all the letters from Oscar Wilde. And then the unknown part of Oscar Wilde in Italy, how he was involved in the literature world in Naples, in Italy, and the last years of his life. That's it. I'm here.
So that was wonderful, Renato. Thank you so much. That was a great introduction to the book. And people are already asking in the Q&A what book they should read about Oscar Wilde. And of course, the answer is they should start by reading your book about Oscar Wilde. To begin the commentary, I'm going to turn to Stefano Evangelista, who is in Trinity College, Oxford right now. This is very much his field of research. He's the author of a book called The Reception of Oscar Wilde in Europe, and another book on British aestheticism in ancient Greece. Stefano, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larry. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel alongside all such distinguished colleagues to celebrate Renato's book. Maybe, I mean, Renato, I thought, gave a very beautiful personal introduction to Oscar Wilde, right? You know, kind of, he told us how his story interacts with his. I should perhaps also briefly say for people who may not know Oscar Wilde's life that well, that Oscar Wilde's relationship with Italy really centered around two important trips, which are the trips that Renato talks about. One of them Wilde undertook when he was a very young man, and he was studying at Oxford at the time, and the discovery of Italy very much went together with the discovery of, let's say, the wider world. You know, that kind of narrative of freedom, of becoming, that's very important to Wilde as a writer. And he left us poems and letters, etc., about Italy. But remember that Wilde was very young then, and while, you know, he was already Oscar Wilde, he was also somebody who was seeing Italy in a way through the spectacles of other English writers, etc. So his writings about Italy then maybe a little bit more formulaic, a little bit kind of less original. But then his other major moment of being in Italy is after he is released from prison. And that's the period which Renato's book treats in most detail, and he gives us a lot of documents so that we can look at Oscar Wilde in Italy on our own, as it were, right? And kind of hear his voice as much as possible. And that's obviously an incredibly complicated moment for Wilde's life. As I said, he's out of prison. He was once a celebrated writer, you know, one of the kind of major literary celebrities in Britain at the time. And all of a sudden, he's persona non grata in Britain. He has to emigrate to the continent, first in France and then in Italy. So my own interest in Wilde, as Larry said, stems from a book I edited a few years ago on the European reception of Oscar Wilde, where really what we tried to do was trace this incredibly starkly different story of Wilde's silencing in Britain after the trial, and put it against the celebration of Wilde that took place in basically all over Europe from you know, the 1890s all the way through to the 19th century. So while Wilde became kind of, you know, was shoved into the margins very much of English literature after the scandal of the trial, on the continent there was a proliferation of translations, of productions, of criticism of writings about Wilde. And that's, again, a narrative that's very very relevant to the story that Renato tells in his book. I'm also interested in Wilde in my current project, which is a book on literary cosmopolitanism at the turn of the 20th century that's coming out this year, in which Wilde is really one of the archetypal or most interesting figures. And so what I want to do is I just want to give you a little quotation from Oscar Wilde, just to frame this notion of cosmopolitanism, but also to frame the notion of identity. We've heard from Renato Miracco's own account now how important Wilde was to his own sense of identity, right? You know, and Wilde himself was somebody who insisted on the complexity of his own identity. So I want to read to you just one sentence that he wrote to the French writer Edmond de Goncourt. Goncourt was a very important French writer at the end of the 19th century, and his diary, he and his brother were famous saloniers in Paris. They entertained a lot of writers, etc. And Wilde was one of the people who visited. The Goncourts then started publishing their diary. And, you know, this was quite a scandalous thing because there was a lot of gossip and stuff that wasn't meant for publication, as it were, that people said in their home. And all of a sudden found its way in the press. And Wilde was one of the people who had, as I said, attended the Goncourts' salons. And he found that all of a sudden in the French press there was his gossiping about Swinburne and other English poets. And he was quite taken aback by this. And so he wrote back to Goncourt in order to explain his own position of a writer who has to negotiate different countries, right? And somebody who's being read in different countries and how difficult it is. And this is how he encapsulated himself. He said, quote, "French by sympathy, I am Irish by race, and the English have condemned me to speak the language of Shakespeare." So French by sympathy, I am Irish by race, and the English have condemned me to speak the language of Shakespeare. So here we are, 3 countries that shaped Wilde as a person and as a writer. France, connected with sympathy, with emotion, with imagination, with projection, with desire, all of that. Ireland, connected with race, a type of identity that's based on ethnicity, on blood, on ancestry. And I think it's really important that Wilde remarks on his ancestry, on his Irish ancestry, Irish identity here, because very often when he was abroad, and that's also the same case in Italy, people thought of Wilde as a British writer. Whereas of course, when he was in England, everybody would have been conscious all the time that Wilde was a foreigner to England. He was Irish. So this double sense of foreignness is something that's kind of important, I think, for us to understand, in order to understand how Wilde moved internationally. And then finally, England, he says, the English have condemned me to speak the language of Shakespeare. So England is connected to literature, to his identity as a writer, but also that word condemned here is very strong. It's the word of an Irish writer, of somebody who feels in a position of kind of semi-colonization, as it were. England is connected to imposition, to obedience, to violence, and all that. But because Wilde is, if we take Wilde too seriously, we're always in the wrong. We always have to understand that he's being ironic there as well. Clearly, that sense, that condemnation of speaking the language of Shakespeare is also a way of elevating himself as high as Shakespeare, almost, right? So I wanted to share this quotation with you for 2 reasons. First of all, is to ask us to think about always about the kind of misanabim almost of Wilde's identities, the fact that he's a foreigner everywhere and doubly a foreigner in some places. And also to show how important France was to Wilde. Wilde kind of read French literature, wanted to be a French writer even. He wrote Salome, one of his main works, in French, and used the social networks of France to become an international writer. So my questions, as when we go back to Renato at the end of our panels, are first of all, if you could frame us the relationship between France and Italy for Wilde. He tells the story about Italy. What does Italy have that France doesn't have for Wilde? How is Italy different from his experience of France? My guess, or what struck me, let's say, when reading his book, was the fact that France for him is very much connected to sociability, to being in salons, in theater, in the media, as the anecdote from Goncourt testifies. Whereas in Italy, reading Renato's book especially, you get the sense of Wilde having to hide, of Wilde having to turn journalists away from his home. That's not the Wilde that we knew from before the trials, right? And that sense of anonymity, right? Of having to kind of almost erase his name is a really complex experience, obviously, especially for somebody like Wilde, who loved to be in the center of attention, to be talked about, to loved for his name to be circulated. And the other question I would like to ask Renato, and to ask him to talk about a little bit, is the particular importance of Naples for Wilde and for his understanding of Italy, because Wilde went to Naples when he went to Italy during his exile. And Naples is, of course, a city with an enormously complex and rich cultural heritage. And one of the pleasures of reading Renato's book was precisely to see Wilde interact with this city, of which studies, at least of 19th century English literature, still say too little. So these are my thoughts.
Okay, we'll take a few hours. Don't worry, we have time. Stefano, thank you so much. When we were talking about the Goncourt, I was really surprised because I'm working now for the Philip Collection about an exhibition about Denitis, Manet, Degas, and Caillebotte in that exactly moment. And in so many diary of the Nittis, in the big soiree of the Nittis with Princess Matilde, there is Oscar Wilde. So Oscar Wilde was used just to go to this salon, this beautiful gathering in Paris at the Nittis house or Princess Matilde house, hotel. Was really, it was in the middle of center of the culture and social life at that moment for sure. And that is something that will link again, me, Oscar Wilde, my work all together. What you were asking me, it's about identity, and then I'll come up with the French side. Identity was so important for Wilde, and it was really at the really end of his life. I just would like just to underline letters that he wrote to Robert Ross from Palermo a few months after, before he died. And he say, finally, I have my identity. I was struggling all my life long. Catholic, Protestant, writer, this and this. And now, to all these students, because a lot of people, it was just in a cafe, and where all the people, is Oscar Wilde? Is Oscar Wilde? Is it Oscar Wilde? Or is not? No, it's too fat to be Oscar Wilde. Whatever. Is it Oscar Wilde? Everybody is talking about Oscar Wilde. Is it? So are you Oscar Wilde? They are asking him, and they say, I am. I am. I don't care any longer about to have just a box on my on my identity. I am. And he was struggling all his life long since he was a kid. I like this, I like this, I like impressionist. No, I don't like impressionist. I like this, I like that. So he was judging and just to define himself all his life long. And now he says, I am. What a relief for him. After struggling in Naples, with journalists, as you said, don't talk about me. He wants to translate Salome with a young 25-year-old boy and translated from French to Italian. There was a reading of Salome in Italian at the Circolo Filologico in Naples. He was so happy. I want to stay in Naples. I want to stay in Italy. I want to write again. I don't know what I have to do. I want to stay here. And this came to your questions about Naples and about Paris and French. We have to understand that when Oscar Wilde in London, he was really a good customer of a French bookshop, where you can find so many beautiful books, unknown book. I don't want to say homosexual books, if we can say, just something that you cannot find all over in England. And we have to understand they became friends since the revolutions, just decriminalized the homosexuality. So he can go around wherever he wants, without any judging in any way, without to be persecuted as he was in London. And the French one gave him just a sense of freedom again in his life. And most of his friends in the last part of his life were living in Paris. Maurice was one of the last lover friends or wherever. Sullivan moved from London to Paris. Frank Harris has a house in Paris. Bosie has a house in London and in Paris as well. And so it's much more home for him. And London, Italy was where he would like just to live. Paris was much more possible to live there. You know what I mean? It's much more. He was struggling about money, and in Paris it was much more easy for him in the last 3 years of his life, 4 years of his life. just to get money from friends. Gide gave him money, but all the cultural environment on Paris was much more fitting him in his desire what to be next after prison, after London. And you know, it's really, but Paris was good for him. Out of Paris, not so much, was a little bit boring. So France for him means Paris. Italy for him means Naples, Palermo, and some days in Liguria. These are the three major cities in the last years of his life.
Thank you. I'm going to now turn the floor over to Lucy Ryle, one of the world's most distinguished historians of modern Italy. She is our academic neighbor just up the road from Villa La Pietra at Villa Salviati, professor at the European University Institute. Lucy is the author of Under the Volcano, Revolution in a Sicilian Town, and of course, Garibaldi, Invention of a Hero, among other books. Lucy, let me turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful but fascinating book, not an easy read in many ways, but a wonderful read nevertheless. I'll say something actually, just because you were talking about identity, I'll say something very briefly about myself because I think it might be relevant. I'm obviously not an expert on Oscar Wilde, so I can't really offer very profound thoughts on Oscar Wilde, but I will ask a couple of questions as a kind of non-expert. I'm much more of an expert on Italy, particularly 19th century Italy, but what I do share with Oscar Wilde is the fact that we are both Southern Irish Protestants. And I can say that I think that the problem of identity is a very real problem of identity, really probably from the middle of the 19th century onwards, when nationalism in Ireland starts to become Catholic rather than Protestant. And Protestants are kind of increasingly lose obviously their economic and political power, but also I think very clearly a sense of identity. It makes sense to me what you're saying about his conflicted identity, also in terms of his kind of his national identity. But I'm not going to talk about that. What I wanted to do first of all was say something. This is very much as an outsider, but as someone as Larry said, who wrote a book on Garibaldi, who's another very public figure. And so what I'm struck by reading these letters in particular, so on the one hand reading his letters that you published, which are incredible, and then the other hand reading what the journalists are saying about him, and also what the kind of the news that is going on around him. There seems to be a huge difference between the representation of Oscar Wilde and the being of Oscar Wilde in this period, right? This has always been, and you can see it very clearly in the work of the journalists. I've got open here the piece by Eugenio Zaniboni. That there's a very particular view they're putting out about him as this kind of tragic, leftover figure. So, already even before he dies, it seems from what I can see here, that he's been constructed as a tragic figure, as someone who's been defeated, someone whose desire for freedom and whose desire to what we might call, shape shift, so never to be one person but to always be public, that has been punished. That's the kind of traditional narrative that we've had about Oscar Wilde. You can see it forming already before he dies in the work of some of these journalists who are pursuing him. So it strikes me as a kind of reply to Stefano that it's not surprising in a way that he's shunning journalists, because if that's what they're kind of producing about him, then that's negative. They want to give him negative publicity. However, having said that, if you read the letters are so much more interesting, because what I would say about them, they're depressing, which is why I said the book is not an easy read. They're depressing. They're kind of, they're personally kind of intimately depressing. The fact that after this terrible betrayal, after this terrible experience in prison, he then takes up again with the person who was the, perpetuator of his downfall. And even the way in which he describes it, he's saying to his friend, I'm so sorry that I've taken up again with him, but what can I do? There's this love. For most of us who've, lived long enough and have had different, personal experiences with people, that's kind of quite a familiar sentiment of someone who can't get away from this person who's damaging him. So I thought that it was really rather depressing. It's also, in places it's almost squalid, the things that have been described, having no money, that horrible description of Oscar Wilde in Naples befriending those two English people and being totally charming, so they'll buy him a drink. It hurts to read that, right? It's very personal, it's very intimate. Also the fact that he's drinking too much, and he's got fat, this is all horrid, right? But what it isn't, it strikes me, is in any way tragic, actually. And I think it's fascinating, this sort of dissonance between the kind of grinding depressingness on the one hand, which is seeming to be what he's living, and the kind of journalistic attempt to turn it into a grand tragedy. But also the other thing I'd say is that in between these kind of depressing moments and not having enough money, he also seems to be having quite a good time. But maybe this is all because we're all stuck indoors in the time of COVID, but some of the things that he's describing, they sound like a lot of fun. So I guess, and so what I wanted to ask really, yes, so, and the final thing I would say about that is that, so when you talk about freedom and the kind of way, what he does with his identity, it seems he has found a strange kind of freedom from being Oscar Wilde, that he can now just be himself, basically. It's exactly what you said, Renato. So I wondered, is what you make of this, really, because although you're the person who writes the preface, Kennicott, isn't it? Yeah, Kennicott.
Yeah.
He interprets what's happening, but you don't really, Renato. You kind of pull back from saying this is what you really think about Oscar Wilde's last days. So I'd like to push you on that, because I came away from the book thinking really the real problem is that he gets sick and he dies, but there's nothing inevitable about that. That's someone who's still writing, that's still doing. So I wondered I could just push you to say about how you do actually view this crucial period at the end, towards the end of his life. Then second thing, I'll try and be quick, is about the seduction of Italy. And I wondered, who's doing the seducing here, actually? Is Oscar, it seems to me Oscar Wilde is at least in part seducing Italy. As being seduced by Italy. And, reading what he says about Italy in the way, particularly the early letters, but even in some of the later ones, it seems to me to be rather a kind of honestly unoriginal view of Italy. This is the Italy of, orange trees and sunshine and, beautiful, careless youths. It's actually quite a kind of classic and relatively unoriginal trope. Even the kind of the homoeroticism, actually, or in general the eroticism, seems to be far from being exclusive to Oscar Wilde. So I have a kind of more personal question, and particularly because you started in the way that you did, Renato, saying, and also the introduction that Larry gave, saying you're someone who's been an ambassador for Italy, a cultural ambassador for Italy, outside Italy for a very long time. You're someone who grew up with this. What do you make of that? Because it seems to me that, this is very much a kind of almost semi-colonial gaze on Italy, right? And there's not much place given in his letters for the Italians themselves. And, looking at it from a 21st century point of view, and this is very much a 21st century point of view, so I don't want to become more moralistic about this. It's also we would say it's also a fairly predatory gaze, right? These are very young boys, very poor young boys that he's having affairs with. So I just wondered, as an Italian, really, and as someone particularly a cultural ambassador for Italy, what you made about this very, very British, very Northern European gaze on and construction of the South, also in a sexual way. Final question, final point, sorry, is about Sicily. I was going to ask you this. Why is Sicily so absent? It's actually it's really a straightforward question as that, because I think there's this, you know, both Capri, but also then and kind of incredibly successfully Taormina and also Palermo becomes a kind of phenomenon of transnational migration of gay men from all over Europe. They come to Taormina. So there's a, you know, and there's also in Palermo to a lesser extent. So I wondered why, I mean, there's obviously personal reasons why you're interested in Naples, and that's fine. But I wondered why simply you didn't say more about Palermo and Taormina, because they're not the same thing. I mean, maybe they're the same thing for someone like Oscar Wilde, but I think they're not the same thing in terms of the kind of the way they represent themselves, and even in terms of their sexuality. But thank you very much. That's enough from me.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you, my dear. I'm so happy. I'll try to summarize in my mind. I would like just to answer at the end of your question, why Taormina? Taormina became just a gay spot in Italy after Wilde. At that time was only von Gloeden who was living in Taormina. And Taormina became just a really gay one place after the scandal of Krupp in Capri. So Capri at the beginning with Anders and with so many others figure became just a spot for gay life. But that was exactly on the edge where Wilde went to Capri. But Taormina for sure was just an innocent, innocent place as well. This, we were talking about Taormina. We don't have to forget that only Sicily, all the south of Italy was really, really important for the gay life, for the English gay, English German gay life. Because you remember, okay, I was in 1893, Bratislav wrote a poem, The Sicilian Boy. And why were the Sicilian Boy saying, oh, the erotism, about male erotism is much more better than female erotism. And that was really a shocking poem. It was published in The Artist. The Artist was really a gay magazine in London in that moment. And we have to understand that in 1866, Swinburne wrote Hermaphroditus. In 1861, Antinous by Jackson. So a lot of English writers were dreaming about this antiquity, Mediterranean, where was just the beginning of a culture, was the Mediterranean in that moment. And everything we have the freedom to go there just to refresh our culture as an English and German people. But in the meantime, we as a gay man or in secret, they say we can have a beautiful life there. Von Platen says, I love German boy, I love French boy, I loved a Neapolitan boy. For me, it was really the best of the best of the best of my life. So there was just written, but it was just this dream about gay life in Italy. And that it's another I would say, tiles on the mosaic. Most of the interview with Wilde in Italy come up later, after he died. The only two that we have is by Zaniboni, you mentioned before, about Matilde Serao. Matilde Serao was really intelligent woman, was really a director of two newspapers in Italy and in Naples, but she was against gay people. In fact, after that article was a lot of Paolo Valera wrote an incredible book about gay life, how the gay life can ruin Italian reputation all over the world.
Mm.
This just to give you a frame of this one. When he was in Cap, the relationship with the English colony in Naples was not good for Wilde. He was like just to escape. He was escaping from London. After the trial, he had the chance to fly to ship to and to go to Paris. But he said, no, I don't want to. I want to go ahead. So I want to go to the prison. I want to go there. I want to see what's next, what is ahead. So find some people, and that was really starting to divide Bosie, Lord Douglas, and Oscar Wilde. Lord Douglas went during the prison. Oscar Wilde, he was in jail, went for 1 year in Capri with his friend, and he was in touch with the English colony in Capri and in Naples with his grandma as with his aunt. And then when he came with Oscar Wilde, nobody wants to see him. An ambassador, say a messenger from the ambassador say, you have to leave him if you want to see us. Otherwise, we cannot see you and Oscar Wilde together in Naples. Go away for him. And his mom says, you know, I received just a letter from the ambassadors. Please leave Oscar Wilde if you want. If you want me to give you 200 pounds a year to survive. And so he wrote a letter to his mom, and he tried to make some distance from Oscar Wilde. I was helping him. No, he's my dear friend, but no, I don't love him, but he loves me. So it was really struggling in this way. And was really, so the English colony was really not friend with Oscar Wilde. Especially in Naples, especially when he was in Naples, especially when he was in Palermo. I didn't mention, there is a beautiful book about Arcudi, who did a book about Sicily and Oscar Wilde. At that time was not, people used to go to Sicily, to Palermo, to have just sex affair as well. But was not the real spot, Sicily, in that moment. It became just later after Oscar Wilde died. Yes.
Thank you. I'm now going to go to our next panelist, my wonderful NYU colleague, Uli Baer, who is University Professor of Comparative Literature, German, and English. He's also an expert on photography. It's part of his research, and photography is a very important part of Renato's book. Uli is the author of many books, including the Rilke alphabet. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Uli.
Thank you, Larry, for inviting me, and thank you, Renato, for giving us a book that's quite important, I think, in sort of correcting the image of Wilde's years in Italy. The other important biography is Nicholas Frankel's Wilde, The Unrepentant Years, which takes care of this misperception that Wilde was so kind of crushed by his prison sentence that he really gave up on life. He dies, as Lucy says, very young in 1900, 3 years after he gets out of prison, but he's trying to rehabilitate himself. And it's quite moving, Renato, that you actually started by talking about The Happy Prince, Wilde's children's stories and fairy tales, which is the first story about a prince who relegates suffering out of his kingdom, and there's no sorrow or suffering. This is one of the first stories that Wilde publishes, and then he has so much sorrow in his own life. It's a kind of terrible irony. And I wanted to start with a quote that I put in the chat here from Lady Windermere's Fan, which is a play that actually makes me cry every time I read the ending. It's about a woman who thinks her husband is having an affair, but it sort of turns out differently. It is a fantastic play. It is not as great as The Importance of Being Earnest, which is the greatest play in the English language, excepting Shakespeare. And And so this sentence is very important because we are being forced into certain kinds of positions. And Lucy just raised the 21st century question that Wilde is still on trial today. There's still a kind of ambivalence about him. So this is the quote: "There are moments when one has to choose between living one's own life fully, entirely, completely, or dragging out some false, shallow, degrading existence that the world in its hypocrisy demands. But on both sides of this equation," and Renato, you're saying in Italy, Wilde was able to live in a certain kind of freedom, as Stefano also said, there are moments when one has to choose. And Wilde was always, in a way, tormented by this, that you have to choose freedom, that it doesn't come freely, that you have to choose by the world and its hypocrisy. This is a very interesting quote by Lord Darlington in this play, Lady Windermere's Fan. And so I wanted to ask you, when he's in Italy, Stefano already touched upon this, the reception is a little bit different. Although it's delayed, the Italian journalists who interview him don't really talk about that they're giving him better treatment. They have very vicious attacks on him. And England is so filled with hatred when he comes out of prison in 1897. I think we must not forget that. And England will pardon Oscar Wilde in the year 2013 in the Alan Turing law, when they pardon 50,000 homosexuals, and they will not name Wilde specifically. So it takes until 2013, which is very much a 21st century, to even acknowledge that the English legal system punished somebody for something that he shouldn't have been punished for, that really destroyed him. That turns him into a martyr, into a kind of hero. Certainly, we have to think Walt Whitman dies in 1892 in New Jersey, who's still not acknowledged really in a way or debated in the same way Wilde is. Wilde writes a very early text on Shakespeare, The Portrait of Mr. W.H., which is really clearly a way to read the sonnets as a kind of partly a gay love story. And that is dismissed by Shakespeare scholars as witty and not well informed. And I want to kind of end, Renato, by asking you, you make in this book, you created a different impression of Wilde that we didn't quite know, because you have discovered and found so much of the Italian responses to him. And it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that, actually to acknowledge the journalists, the people he was meeting. Lucy said, or Stefano, Graham Greene's grandfather goes and buys him a drink and he regales him for 1 hour. This is the only way he can pay for his drink, by using his wit and his kind of eloquence at this point. It's both touching, poignant, as Lucy said. At least I think there was someone who sat down with him and listened to him, because the world is really not listening at this point to Oscar Wilde very much. He's trying to sell a play, it doesn't quite work, etc. On page 117 of your book, and we should we'll talk about the cover of this book in 1 second. On page 117, you quote a letter that he writes to Robbie Ross, his friend, in 1998, which is quite important. And I'll read that here, which is a kind of defense of himself, which is really unusual and exceptional. And he says, "A patriot put in prison for loving his country loves his country. And a poet in prison for loving boys loves boys. To have altered my life would have been to admit that the Uranian love is ignoble. I hold it to be noble, more noble than other forms." And Renato, let me ask you this question. That is another sentence by Oscar Wilde, which I think has not been understood, assimilated, and that probably almost no one would really consent to, that homosexual love is actually for him more noble than other forms, which is really heterosexual love. Wilde still provokes after his death in a way, and there are a couple of questions in the chat. Did he talk about relationship between older men and younger boys, which, as we know, is still socially entirely, it's first of all illegal depending on the age in certain countries. And the culture that we're putting Wilde in Italy, there's a certain opening. There's a possibility for him to live. They are the kind of points that Lucy talked about, very poignant, very sad. Also, I think incredibly touching that he does return to Bosie. Bosie betrays him so many times in a way, but Bosie also sends him an incredible love letter when he's about to go to prison and says, "My dearest Oscar, I cannot live without you." I republished this letter, which had only been published by Frank Harris in 1910, and then in 1924 in a private collection. It had never been transcribed until this last year. So this letter hasn't been surfaced. Wilde wants to be, as you said, who he is. He wants to say, I am, when he responds, yo, I am this person. We today don't even know how to make sense of that because we think sexuality is an identity. It wasn't for Victorians. It was a practice. There was no identity. You were who you were. So Renato, in some ways, I think you kind of rehabilitate Wilde. You also give some credit, I think, which is important, to Italy as a culture at this moment, with the caveat that there's a tinge or a suspicion of exploitation, which is probably not entirely accurate, that these young men were exploited. I don't believe that's actually quite the case. And I think you find evidence that this is not the case, that they were not exploited, depending how you define exploitation. But that's a really important part, because Lucy said in the 21st century, we would put that framing in immediately. There's exploitation, they're very poor, they are of huge class distinctions. Wilde wants to be a gentleman. They are not in England, etc. But at the same time, it opens up the question of what Wilde means today to anyone. He's kind of the hero for, LGBT writers against his own wishes, probably because he was sentenced. And I'll end the question, Renato, sort of that I think you're kind of rehabilitating it. And Stefano, I would ask you whether there's a statue to Oscar Wilde, and at Oxford University, there's a statue to Garibaldi in Washington Square Park, a block away from my house, by the Italian-American community. Is there a statue to Oscar Wilde to celebrate him as their greatest alumnus, actually? When he returned once to Oxford, we know this, but it's not exactly that Oxford really embraced one of their greatest writers as their, the great son. So in some ways, I think these attitudes of institutions are quite important. So I'll end right here. And Renato, really, I just want to, Larry said I work on photography. You may want to say a little bit about choosing the cover and the responses, and kind of what kind of support you got or didn't for using these images in this really important book. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, really. Okay, photography, start with photography. I had just, I need to show to the people what Italy was at that moment. So I want to private collection, and I set up just a little PowerPoint about photograph. Let me talk before, and just to show which is the shock of Oscar Wilde. Why beautiful coat, white hat, and going in Naples. And in Naples was really a shock because it was really poor. And in my PowerPoint, you can see he arrived in the huge Grand Hotel in Naples, where he was paying, and Bosi was later contributing a little bit. Then he moved to a little villa, a big villa with a waiter, with Zaniboni interview him. And then in the last moment of his life, in the last 6 months of his life, he was living in a little poor neighbor. So was really sad for him. And he would say, thank you, Robert Ross, I received your dress, your coat. Now it's the same coat we can see in a photograph. It was somebody, maybe Marco, one of his lovers in Rome, took him in Rome in front of St. Peter. And later we can see this in the PowerPoint. So first of all, I would like just to see Oscar Wilde in Naples, Capri, in that, exactly, that one. He just received a few days before this beautiful, he's proud to be, I am what I am again, because the formality, the formal dress was so important for him. He was a gentleman. This about photography, and my dream, because you are provoking me, my dream is just to launch a competition to the young photographer to give an homage to Wilde now. In this sense, you know, when they opened the prison where Oscar Wilde was open, most of the 20 important artists all over the world give him just an homage as an installation, a poem, Patti Smith, wherever, a photograph as an homage to Wilde. I would like just to launch here in a large, broad sense. I would like just to launch the young photographer to give an homage to Wilde. What means Wilde for them now, first of all. And then we can work on this. We can work on this. Coming back to your first question about the cover, you can see right now how we still have a problem with Wilde, with sexuality, with gay, with homosexual. I don't want to put Wilde in a box of gay, frankly speaking. He was loving what he wants. Now we have, I don't know, I don't know how to explain. Now to be free, we want to put people in boxes. It's not, it's exactly the contrary of freedom. For sure, in that moment, to be gay, to love a man was really important at that moment. But in the meantime, Wilde wants to be free. And what I really would like just to point out for the cover, we had a huge problem with the cover. We have the Italian edition of the book and an English edition of the book. The English edition of the book is splitting between the United States and Europe, England, and Ireland. So the England publisher wants to have a much more traditional. Wilde is Wilde. So he has to be in a beautiful dress, in one of his oldest photograph of Wilde. This is Wilde for us. No, it's not true. And day by day, I convinced them to put Wilde in a Greek costume in 1878, in a Greek costume there. So it's much more, I don't know, ambiguous, but not because I would like just to target him as a gay person, but just to give him the freedom of not to be constrained in that old photo of him. And then I found this beautiful photo that von Gloeden gave to him. And I was struggling with the grandchildren, Mary Holland. He said, no, Renato, it's not Naples. This is Dieppe, where he went after the prison. I said, darling, I'm so sorry to disappoint you. That is Vesuvio. That is the terrace in front of the Vesuvio. It's Naples, for sure. Dieppe doesn't have this landscape, for sure. So, and then I say, okay, can we put this as just to link between von Gloeden and Wilde? Can we have this link just to show his last life? This is von Gloeden gave this photograph in the last year. So this is why Wilde dedicated one of his last poem to him, and it's in a copy of his poem to von Gloeden, say, thank you for your photo. This is the frame. The English doesn't want to, was too porno, was too much for them, doesn't represent Wilde at all. So we were struggling with them at the really hand. The American one say, yes, maybe, no, maybe. So at the really hand, till now, and we are talking about 1 year ago, when we decided about the cover, we are struggling about the identity of Wilde. as well. And that's it's really in such a way painful. This is why I really would like, you say, I rehabilitate this figure. No, I would like just to tell the truth. That's it. That's it. That's it. It's so many times it's hard to accept the truth. But when he says why you don't write anymore, and he say, because I've written all there was to write. I wrote when I did not know life. Now that I know the meaning of life, I have no more to write. So this is really important, because always we are asking to Oscar Wilde to, oh, he didn't write. Why he didn't write? He has to write a new poem and a new comedy, a new wonder, No, he was pretend to write to get money. And it really ends. Because now, as Sartre was just pointed out, Genet, Wilde, in this sense, are much more similar. And he say, when Wilde said to Gide, I put all my genius in my life, and I put my talent all in my work, this is exactly what happens to him.
Okay, thank you, Renato. So Perry and I are going to give you a few last comments before we open this up. We'll do it together. Let me turn this over to Perry first, co-director of NYU Florence. Perry.
So I think we're going to bring us back at least briefly to Florence here at the end. First, to say how honored and delighted we are to have been able to participate in this as NYU Florence. But also, I'm going to take you back very briefly to that 1875 first visit that Wilde makes to Italy as a 20-year-old college student. And actually, Renato, you begin your section on the seduction of Italy in the 19th century with the sonnet Approaching Italy, which I think he publishes in 1881, and which, as Stefano has pointed out, is the work of a very, very young poet. And, you know, as Lucy had said, is not necessarily profoundly original, right? It begins, I reached the Alps, the soul within me burned, Italia, my Italia, at thy name. And of course, reaching back to that idea of being condemned to write in Shakespeare's language, it is a sonnet. But what I actually wanted to bring up was the subject of two poems that he wrote about Florence, visiting it for the first time in June of 1875. And there was a lovely piece a year ago by Jane Farrell in the Florentine, remembering that brief summer visit. And what's interesting is that the two poems that I'm talking about, one of them, San Miniato, and the other, the one that is published as by the Arno, start as the same poem, because the first draft of San Miniato, which he writes after a visit in June 15th, 1875, is longer than the poem which is eventually published as San Miniato. It's 6 verses. It starts with climbing the mountainside up to this holy house of God, where once that angel painter trod who saw the heavens opened wide. So it starts with climbing up and with Fra Angelico. But the first draft of the poem then becomes very secular. It becomes a poem about nightingales and oleander and the night in Florence. And in fact, when the poem about San Miniato is finally published a year later in 1876 in the Dublin University magazine, it has become a shorter poem, 4 verses long. The nightingale is gone, the oleander is gone, all of the sort of secular beauty of the night is gone, and it's become a much more intensely religious poem, which ends, "O crowned by God with love and flame, O crowned by Christ the Holy One, O listen, ere the searching sun show to the world my sin and shame." But he then, as a poet who doesn't let things go to waste recycles all the rest into another poem about being by the Arno, and there's the nightingale and the dawn and the oleander and the myrtle, and it's all used again in a completely secular poem about being by the Arno in Florence. So I just wanted to suggest back that when we think about both his complicated identity and his complicated relations to Italy, we might look back to even when he was 20 years old, the question of how he was thinking about integrating or separating the many different emotions, both aesthetic, emotional, the complications of appreciating Italy, and how he was either going to write together or write differently about the different emotions, about the sacred and the profane. Lara?
Okay, so what I would add to this, before we turn it back to you, Renato, are 3 observations from a cultural historian and 1 question. The 3 observations would be, first, to me, one of the things that's really interesting about Wilde in Italy is where it fits into our understanding of North and South in Europe, and the way that the North of Europe in particular, here going back to the 18th century, to the age of Winckelmann's aesthetics and Goethe's Italienische Reise, the North appropriates the South and its classical legacy and establishes a very particular North-South relationship in Europe, part of which involves the possibility of a certain kind of cultural tourism. So the second point is connected to tourism and where Wilde stands in the transition from the world of the Grand Tour in the 18th century. And a lot of the writings, including the poetry that Perry was referencing from the earlier visit to Italy, still feels a little bit like the world of the Grand Tour, in which you go to Italy to complete your education, to the world of modern Mediterranean tourism as we know it today. And here I wanted to reference what Uli had to say just briefly about the economics of Wilde's stay in Naples. One sense that for Naples is a place where he needs to make his money last, right, in order to be able to live there. That feels very modern, our understanding of Mediterranean tourism, as does perhaps your initial remarks, Renato, about Italy is a place where Wilde experiences a certain kind of freedom, including sexual freedom, and also a kind of escape after trial in prison. Third, I wanted to mention this with reference to NYU Florence and Villa La Pietra, because our great patron at NYU Florence, Harold Acton, sees himself as someone who is building the life of an aesthete, right? His memoirs are memoirs of an aesthete, on the shoulders of someone, of Oscar Wilde. Page 1 of the memoir, and Francesca Baldry actually just sent me the page 1, which I didn't have in my study, talks about what it means to create aestheticism in the 20th century on the shoulders of old Oscar, Oscar being the older Oxford generation on which Acton is trying to build some new sense of what it means to be an aesthete in the 20th century. So Wilde, a giant who you need to build upon, but for someone of Acton's generation, someone you also need to move out of the way in order to proceed. So the question I want to ask you has to do with something that I think all of the people in the audience are very familiar with, which is the background that's right behind you. Uli referenced photography. I assume it's a Gloeden photograph that we're looking at over your shoulder in your background, Renato. We're looking at a young man standing at a ledge. His butt is right behind your head, and there it is. He's in a very, what I'm sure Gloeden understands to be a Praxiteles pose, probably modeled on the Praxiteles Hermes at Olympia, and would be identified by Winckelmann probably as a Praxitelean figure. I'm a little curious how, if you were to turn around, figuratively, you obviously don't need to turn around, but he's right behind you, how you would look at that photograph through Oscar Wilde's eyes. And here I want to come back to something that Lucy said about the semi-colonial gaze. When we're looking at that young man through Oscar Wilde's eyes, are we seeing Praxiteles and the classical legacy of the South? Are we seeing photography as the art form of the 20th century? Does Wilde get that? Is he interested in the possibilities of that art form? Are we seeing in the naked bodies of the young men the fantasy of a certain kind of Mediterranean freedom? Northerners, we know, flock to southern beaches for Freikörperkultur, right? And the possibility of being naked on the beach. Or are we just looking at a cute butt and a sexual opportunity? Or are we looking at some combination of those four things? Would you gloss that for us? So the photograph and the poetry for Perry, and then we'll open this up to questions from the public. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. We have to frame where this photograph came from, why. Von Gloeden went to Taormina. He was totally sick. He met just some boys there and was spending some nights with him. And all his family say, stay away from Germany right now. We give you money, what do you want? And he was building up just a new kingdom of photography who can combine photography with the naked man. So a dream, a Wilhelm dream with reality in his life. It's just a combination of the two. So the only way he can depict it, photograph the young man was in the Wilhelm old-fashioned way. So he put just some fabric around the dust, some crown, something that will be, there is a zebra skin on the floor in this one. You can see there is another series of this one. This came in two edition, one with zebra without the other one with zebra. So it just to have just this dream of, and was so popular at that moment. You can see kings, Guglielmo Marconi, just to mention some of them, went to buy photograph of von Gloeden. Was so famous at that moment, was really incredible in his life. And so we have to understand when this came from. We have to say that in the meantime, in the same year, Edward Carpenter wrote a book about homosexuality. George Cecil Eves put just an order, just a club of gay men in London and in Paris. In the meantime, Kimberly mentioned for the first time the word homosexuality. So it's just there is a cultural background. Thomas Cook was building an empire about going to Italy, because you can do whatever you want. You can have your sexual desire. You can have what you want in sex. Following also Marchese de Sade, who wrote in 1774 a book about Italy and trip to Italy. If you want to lose your virginity, you have to go to Italy, in the south of Italy as well, in Naples, Marquis de Sade. So Frederick Engels in that moment was really afraid about gay people. This is the frame, because he said to Marx, they can be just a little bit society. We have to be careful to the gay people. Do you know what I mean? This is the background, the cultural background where von Gloeden took his photo. And I really would like just to underline this. We have to research more and more and more about that moment. We would like just to put apart. We don't, so many times we don't know, we don't want to know, but we really need to put up, to have just a cultural background, sexual culture background in that moment. And when Wilde decided just to go to Italy, was just Thomas Cook say, you can live in Italy for £200 a year. You can spend your Christmas in Rome, Easter in Rome, and then you can go in Sicily, and then you can go in the winter, you can go in Naples, because there is a San Carlo in Naples. San Carlo was called the Italian Covent Garden. So in Naples, in Rome, there were more than 10 hotels called in English colony, English hotel, and Via Condotti in Rome was the English colony. You have to put all this together. I would, before the question, the answer the question, I would like just to see if we can see some photo of Wilde, some photo of that moment. I would like just to point out, just to give you another sense, another frame of big frame of, yes, this is a Wilde in Greek costume. We're supposed just to be the cover of the book before the one we chose. Go ahead, thank you so much. This is two scandals of Oscar Wilde, or before Oscar Wilde. This is the Prince Victor, who was, the Queen sent him away for 6 months because he was involved in the Cleveland scandal in London 1 year before the trial of Wilde. Can you believe this? And this one was another scandal, Bolton and Fanny. They were two men who used just to dress in women dress, and one of the Lord Barton was involved with this one. And when they discovered he had an affair with both of them, he committed a suicide. There is another one about the Secretary of State of London in that moment, who was involved in a gay story. This is why, just to give you a background, why they were so harsh toward Wilde, because they have to give an example to that moment before these 3 gay sexual scandal in London. Go ahead, please, Thomas. When Wilde was in prison, this was Wilde in prison. He cannot talk with anybody. He has only 1 hour of freedom a day. He cannot see or talk with anybody, and anybody has to wear just a mask. And this is the boy who was talking with him, and Wilde was put in the dark prison for more than 1 month. Some people say that he was a lover of Wilde, but it was not a sexual lover, but he was loved to talk with him. And when he was publishing his poem, saying, now I'm really accustomed and addicted to my new audience, the poor. Go ahead. This was the first house, it was a Grand Hotel in Naples, the first house where he was with Bosi in Naples. This is the photo of Matilde Serrao, who wrote a nasty article on Wilde. Go ahead. And this was Naples when Wilde went to Naples. These are the photos exactly from a private archive, exactly the year and the month Oscar Wilde was there. So, I mean, this is the background of Oscar Wilde in that moment. This is really important for me. Go ahead, sorry, Thomas. This is the hotel where he was in Capri, Hotel Pagano, because he wasn't allowed to be in Quisisana, was the most famous hotel, because all the English colony pushed him away. As soon as he entered with Bosi in the restaurant, all the English colonies stand up and say, You want him or you want us? And the director of the hotel, the owner of the hotel went to Oscar, say, you have to go away right now. Was incredible. And this is the motto, was one of the lover of von Gloeden in a mask of a fawn. And this was the famous Gambrinus bar, restaurant and bar in Naples. Wilde had he had a private table, and all the people were pointing at him after 1 week. This is Oscar Wilde, you know, this is Oscar Wilde, this is Oscar Wilde. And this is the place where one of the most important interview he gave to this young boy called Giuseppe Garibaldi Rocco. His nickname was Arnaldo dell'Isle, and after Wilde died, he published the interview with him. He was really close friend with him. He was the translator of Salome from French to Italian. He was teaching Neapolitan and Italian to Wilde. And I was talking about this with Mary Holland, the grandson of Wilde. He didn't know about Oscar knew Italian and knew Neapolitan, but Oscar Wilde wrote beautiful letters to Robert Rossi. I have now a new teacher, Giuseppe Garibaldi Rocco, was teaching me Neapolitan, and my Italian is full with Latin words, Italian words, and Neapolitan words as well. And this is the photo we were talking about, and now you can see, as you can see, you didn't see the, oh yes, you see, this is the one with the skin, with the animal skin on. It was really incredible. And this is the last, this is Palazzo Bambino in Santa Lucia, where he was living in the last months, 4 months in Naples. Starting from the huge hotel, passing through a beautiful villa that he was paying with Bosi, and then in the last 4 months here in this, for him, terrible neighbor. Just to give just another frame.
So thank you. We now have about 5 minutes. I'm going to read a couple of questions from the Q&A and then turn it back to you, Renato, and the panelists if they have another minute's worth of commentary that they want to make. The 3 questions that I wanted to mention were from David Koslow, who asks about the larger international effect of Wilde's spectacular and humiliating fall for gay women and gay men, how this intersects with and affects the broader history of homosexuality. There's a question from James Little, who asks about how much bravery and courage was involved in living as an openly gay man in Europe in the late 19th century. And here we might think a little bit about the relationships between different parts of Europe. And finally, from Sam Maverick, who asks whether Wilde writes or talks explicitly about relationships or attractions between older men and younger boys. Anybody want to tackle any of those?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. And Renato, I want to give a bit of context also to Lucy's question. These are kind of 21st century question of relationship, and is it a moment of freedom for homosexual writers afterwards? First of all, there have been so many writers who we would identify as gay today, before and after Wilde, that maybe, yes, he did change things. But I think the context of these images is, we look at it today from our standards today. And when we look at this image of these young men, including probably adolescent boys, from our 21st century perspective, that is probably quite triggering or offensive or actually unacceptable. I think the context of that time is Degas painting ballerinas, is Toulouse-Lautrec painting prostitutes, Juliet Margaret Cameron photographing people, kids as angels. This is the context. And then why I'm raising this context of Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas, still in every museum in the world. because George Bernard Shaw, when he writes in 1910, he says, I met Wilde and I had, quote, all the normal violent repugnance of homosexuality, unquote, that everybody shares. So in some ways, I wonder whether we're putting more scrutiny on this picture behind Renato still today that we wouldn't put on an image by Toulouse-Lautrec or Degas or Rodin, who's sculpting, painting, and photographing 14-year-old girls the entire time, whether the standard is still different. So I'm just curious. I'm not saying the standard is wrong in any way, but I think the context to see this work is the 1890s, when young girls are sexualized everywhere in pop culture. And Larry's question, Wilde loved photography. When he was photographed in New York by Napoleon Savigny and had these images, he knew that his images were critically important to his notoriety and his success. He was posing constantly, and he used images the way today's celebrity use them on Instagram to make his image known.
He bought just a camera. He bought a camera, and he used just to say, you know, now I would like to change. I would like just to be a photographer. And it was just to a photograph of cow, man, of landscape. And I really would like just to change my profession. I would like just to be a professional photographer. In one of the letters that he wrote to Robert Ross. It was really incredible. And there is a lot of photograph of Wilde by himself, and there was a waiter in the restaurant. It was took the photograph of him with Bosie and together and whatever. Was really interested, as you say, in photography as a medium of himself. Thank you, and thank you about Degas. I was studying Degas all my life long, and the ballerina was 14 years old. And he was addicted to photography, and he was inviting all these young girls to his studio to take a photograph of them, and then he transferred in a paintings. Why we are not we don't have the same feeling with Degas or with Toulouse-Lautrec or instead we have with Wilde. This is why, and then as I say so many times, because so many people point out the same questions. When von Gloeden was taking a photograph of the young boy, they gave him money, and I met some grandchildren of that boy say, we have to be thankful to him because now I have a shop, because he gave money to my grandmom and grandfather just to get married and then to build up our new shop that I still have. So there is a gratitude of the Taorminian people in that moment without any shame.
Lucy, Stefano, can I turn this back? Do you have final comments that you'd like to make before we close?
I like to leave the last word to Stefano, so I'll just say something very quickly. I mean, I think what separates that picture behind Renato from the Degas or the Toulouse-Lautrec is that that's more what is the scandalous nature, right? Because the von Gloeden was scandalous in 1900, and it's still scandalous today. It's scandalous today for a different reason, but it remains scandalous. So it's and then that was the first thing I really wanted to say. It's just a thought, something to actually think about what that's all about. And then there's something to do that I can't quite figure out in my mind, but it's got to do with the visibility and invisibility of homosexuality, right? You say, Renato, in your book, right, that the only real source for certainly British 19th century homosexuality really is criminal cases, right? Which is of course why the Oscar Wilde criminal, the court case was so notorious. It wasn't just because it was Oscar Wilde, it was also because the Victorian public had to face the reality of homosexuality, which it generally was hidden, okay? So I think there's something interesting there, reflecting on that. I mean, there's this wonderful, if I may, just 1 second, there's by the so-called cottages, right, in which are the public toilets in London, where was, as we know, a famous meeting place for homosexuality, for homosexuals. That you still today have stuck on them in a London park, no loitering, okay? And what that actually means is, you know, gay men don't think you can come in here and have sex. But of course, the idea is you can't say that, because to say don't have sex in these toilets might be somehow a suggestion to go and have it, right? So there's a very Victorian covering up going on in no loitering. So that makes those photographs interesting, because however actually problematic they are, because I think they are very problematic in many ways, there is a kind of way in which it's interesting and remarkable and worth thinking about the fact that they're actually being photographed at all, right? So there's a statement in the photography themselves, I think, which is interesting. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you to you, my dear.
Thank you. Yes. So thank you. Just perhaps a couple of words, because I think that one thing we've all focused on was the relationship between Wilde's life and kind of the end of Wilde's life and these images, right? And how we're trying to juxtapose these two cultures, and also the scandal and the difficulty of looking at both things in the present, right? What fascinates me about the von Gloedens is exactly that difficulty, the difficulty that we have ethically, etc., and looking at them and trying to reconstruct how people in the 19th century gazed at those images and what kind of projections, what kind of ideas of homosexuality they had, what kind of ideas of where the boundary was between the licit and the illicit was when looking at those pictures. We know that they circulated very widely, and we know that they were also enjoyed by people who were not within gay communities, right? And that seems, I think, much weirder to us in a way than it would have done to people in the 19th century. And what really interests me here is the reversal of the gaze, the stuff that, you know, kind of makes us recoil, you know, is sometimes acceptable to a culture that kind of has so many other kind of ethical qualms about sexuality, and that sense of kind of the complexity of this kind of negotiation of this kind of visibility and invisibility of desire is what is really interesting to me in this case, with these photographs, but also something that is true of Wilde's own life.
Renato, let me give you a chance to say one last word about what you'd like people to take away from your book. You've written it, it's out there, people are reading it. What do you want people to take away from it?
We all live in a gutter, but some of us are looking at the star.
Fantastic.
And Oscar Wilde is always looking at the star, as we have to do.
Congratulations, Renato, on writing this wonderful and challenging book. Thank you all for doing this with us. This has been a really wonderful and exciting panel happening in Florence, in Washington, in New York, and all the virtual spaces that surround those places. Thank you very much to the public for joining us for this event.
Thank you. Thank you for them. Thank you.